attacking different older people.
You guys are disgusting!
Look at the fucking movement. Look. Look. You coward! You
Nowhere else to go.
My phone dropped.
I hope it wasn't.
Anybody with us? I see you shaking your head back there. You should be watching this. Take a lesson in courage.
Man, they declared this. Call the Crusaders.
Cowards!
Nazi supporters.
Our generation theory. Every generation. Law enforcement professionals, huh?
Oh, you got blown up in Afghanistan, eh? And these guys are going to arrest you and push you back when you serve for your country?
Right. You guys keep those mentions. Resign everybody else to serve them. Go for it.
I don't smoke. I'm dying. Children. You don't know my life. You don't know my struggle. I fought for my shit. I survived the worst. This is nothing.
Tell your boss to stop it, huh?
I've been
Follow
blown
the
up.
law.
Peace and love. And if
No
you think
respect
he
for
does,
human dignity
you're wrong.
whatsoever. We're not livestock to make rich boomers. All serial killers are boomers. I almost said that.
We love you all.
All they want is to be heard.
Take a second.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, I need a minute.
You are not a serf.
I did surfing once.
We want to
oh
do
man, I
the
hurt myself big too.
No. You don't want to go SERF. That's what these guys want you to do. They want you to go SERF.
Oh,
Nuremberg 2, boys. Can't wait to see you there.
I don't want to be here.
You guys' grandchildren are going to be born
I'm
into
much rather be
debt,
home with my wife and kids.
owing a piece of their lives to the state. Everyone's going to be slaves. That's a wounded veteran! Yes! That's a wounded veteran! Yes! That's a wounded warrior right there! They got a shield in his fucking head! That guy's Back up! Back up! Back up! Back up!
Hold on, stop pushing.
Back up!
They kicked him in the leg.
Back up! Back up!
Hold on, stop pushing.
They kicked him in the leg. The RCR guy. They booted him. That was weird. There's the one. The one who booted him was this one. Kucher Lazon. He kicked the vet that had the wounded right leg. He kicked him right in the leg. Oh, he's a greasy one. This guy right here. Kucher Lazon. He kicked the...
Hey, what's up, guys? Saw you kicking that wounded veteran while he was down there earlier. You guys are a bunch of thugs, huh?
Didn't want freedom would stop everybody from having
No, not at all. You want to keep the rich guys in power right now, huh? Soaking up all the wealth, buying up all those residential properties, turning the millennials into a bunch of permanent renters, reaching into the pockets of the unborn. deciding all future children to be born into serfdom. That's you guys abusing your citizens, huh?
I am the media now.
Just following orders, just like those guards at the ovens of Auschwitz. That's you, right? You just do as you're told, right?
Moi, j'ai pas la même opinion. These guys are getting in.
Hey, what's up, troops? It's Ops Sgt-Maj for Veterans for Freedom, Jeff Evely, back with you now here on the 23rd of November as the Public Order Emergencies Commission is underway, and things are really heating up this week too. I got a really special guest lined up for us here today. His name is Mark Friesen. He's been a PPC candidate as well as a Buffalo Party candidate from Saskatchewan. I've been boning up on my Friesen here to prepare for this interview, and I was just messaging with Mark, and I'm not sure where he's at. It seems like he might be tied up with something, so just wouldn't be my show if it wasn't for a blooper here and there, but that's okay. We're going to power through it, and I hope that he joins us in a few minutes once he gets done with whatever has him held back right now. So for those of you who don't know Mark, like I said, he was a PPC candidate there in the last federal election, and he was also a Buffalo Party candidate. So he's been a pretty strong voice for freedom out there in the ecosystem, and he has a lot of content online. So I thought while we're waiting for Mark here, maybe we'll just let him kind of introduce himself, and I'll show you a couple of videos. And I think that as some regular listeners will realize, I'm a PPC guy myself, and V4F doesn't take any kind of a political position or endorse any kind of political party. Of course, we're an apolitical institution, but we as individuals, of course, we all have our politics. And so I'm open and candid about mine so that we're as transparent as we can be and everybody understands the view that I'm coming at these issues with. Anyway, yeah, I have reason to believe I could be a PPC candidate at some point in the future, and Mark and I would probably have a lot to talk about, so I'm really interested to speak with him. I hope we can make it in here, but while we wait, let's just get started with a little bit of where I think I find this, some of this area for overlap may be. Now, naturally, you can expect that we're both going to have bones to pick with Pierre Poilievre. So here is Mark. He's attending a meeting with Pierre Poilievre. I believe this was at a stop in Saskatchewan when he had the opportunity to kind of drop in and put Pierre on the spot here about a couple of things. So I'll let him take it. Oh. Chinese said, no, we can't watch that. Come on, TikTok. No, the CCP does not want us hearing what Mark has to say to Pierre Poilievre here, it seems. Nice, TikTok. Okay. So I'm just going to hit that with a refresh. But I saw this on Mark's TikTok. Oh, here we go.
All right, thanks for coming. Okay, we'll do a shot here.
I have one question.
Oh,
I have for you.
yeah.
I'd love for you to answer.
Fire away.
You've denounced the...
For crying out loud, Evely. Pardon me here, folks. My technical difficulties. I'm going to drop that out of the stream here for a second. I just hit a key with my pinky finger. And I don't even know what it was. So, here we go.
For coming. Okay, we'll do a shot here.
I have one question.
Oh,
I have for you.
yeah.
I'd love for you to answer.
Fire away.
You've denounced the World Economic
Yes.
Forum vehemently.
Yes.
You denounced the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, the SDGs.
I haven't read it. I don't know what it is.
You haven't read it?
No, I haven't.
That's interesting.
Do you want to do a shot?
Sure.
All right.
Very good. Thank you.
All right. I'll have to look at it.
Yes, you will.
I don't,
It's very important.
I have a simple rule. If I haven't read it, I don't comment on it.
You need to read it. It's extremely
Thank you
important.
for the good recommendation.
Absolutely.
I'll have a look at it.
Very good.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
How you doing?
Okay, so if we're kind of walking through this again, what happened was Mark walked up here to just do a handshake and a photo op with Pierre, but while he was at it, he really put him on the spot with respect to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so Pierre replied that he hasn't read them, and that's something that Mark has been very vigilant in pointing out. Is that he's denouncing the WEF and stuff like this. He says he's going to ban the WEF from his cabinet, but he's not denouncing the Sustainable Development Goals. And not only that, but he says that he hasn't read them. Yeah, I have a comment here. Darlene Cameron is saying that he hasn't read them. Oh, wait, here she is. He hasn't read it. Talk about ignorant, eh? Well, I don't know if it's ignorance. I don't really know. It seems like it might be willful. And I've seen Mark pointing out in some other videos that Pierre voted for the Sustainable Development Goals, I think in 2008, 2010, and 2015, something like that. So I was really interested to hear more about that, because he's really tracking these issues pretty deep, especially with respect to the SDGs and the UN Agenda 2030, 2021, all that stuff. And so I think he's a pretty astute guy, and he seems like he's pretty widely read and stuff like that. I'd be really interested to hear him give us a deep dive on some of this stuff. But let's see. This was something else that he had on his TikTok here. He's really active on TikTok, so go over there and give him a follow if you're into that stuff. Yeah, he's one of these guys who's kind of calling climate hoax as well. I think the extent of my reading in this stuff goes about as far as the IPCC reports, and I enjoy in particular Bjorn Longberg. He seems to do a really good job of sort of dissecting those and deconstructing them and calling BS on the balls and strikes and whatnot. But anyway, here's a neat little clip here. No, it's TikTok going to do the same thing again, probably.
Russia's deadly wildfires, the smog-filled cities and poor harvest are being seen by some environmentalists as signs of climate change. Let's now cross live to London to discuss this with Piers Corbyn. He's an astrophysicist and also founder of Weather Action. Good to have you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us live there in London. So what we're seeing here is a drastic change in climate, aren't we?
Well, climate has always been changing, but this has nothing to do with man. In fact, we predicted that there would be extreme heat in East Europe and Russia this summer. And it's caused by a certain circulation pattern. CO2 does not cause circulation patterns. What causes those is a combination of solar activity and the state of the phases of the moon.
But hang on, Piers, excuse me, just a minute. You say this isn't caused by man. How come they're reporting this heat wave is recognised as the worst in 1,000 years of recorded history in Russia? And surely man has got something to do with this, hasn't he?
No, nothing to do with it. The only connection is man is here at the same time as the sun and the moon are doing things. You see, a very similar situation happened about 132 years ago, where there was the same sun, Earth, lunar, magnetic states. There was heat waves in Russia, and there were also floods in Pakistan as now. And in the previous few years, there was also floods in the English summers, also 132 years ago. So these things are dictated by solar activity in the moon. They're nothing to do with mankind, and those who say that are just trying to make money out of it.
But are we not going to see this? Are we not going to see this again next year, the year on? I mean, it's quite recent that
that's a very interesting question. These things do come in bursts, and we're working on that very question, those forecasts. We did say there would be a series of wet summers in England, for example, which we've had. Now, will there be a series of these very hot summers in Russia? We don't know. We have to work on that. But I assure you, it's nothing to do with carbon dioxide. And if you stop driving around Moscow, it won't affect next summer one jot.
Well, how come then so many climate change scientists disagree with you and they get so much support for what they say?
They're on a gravy train, for heaven's sake.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
That's glorious. I love that line right at the end. They're on a gravy train, for heaven's sakes. Yeah, that and like before we even get into, I guess, subversion, particularly at the hands of the Chinese, we know that they got their tentacles into everything, especially financially, and they're going around bribing everybody. And they did the best they could to, they were quite successful in effectively co-opting the WHO to tell us all that their example of harsh lockdowns is the one that should be followed. And I recall we even had our own scientist there with the WHO who pretended like there was something wrong with the connection as he was being interviewed by Taiwanese news and asking whether or not WHO would recognize Taiwan as a country. It was quite the affair. It was something it was really something to have to live through, to watch this stuff happening around you, especially for a guy like me who has kind of been calling balls and strikes on a lot of this stuff for a number of years and getting called crazy for it. I think that's a really interesting kind of little video there. I really dig that, the guy with the crazy hair. And I think he handles the interviewer very well. He's talking about, everybody's saying the same thing and you're not. That is that's called a bandwagon fallacy. And just because an opinion is popular doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And a lot of what we're seeing, in the scientific community is that it's been co-opted with, even the Lancet completely immolating its reputation, publishing a letter that says that that everybody should take the vaccine and so on and so forth. So we've really seen sort of the credibility of a lot of institutions turn to ashes throughout this whole process of the pandemic. And we know that, they're using a lot of junk science, say, for pushing a lot of the trans agenda to boost those puberty blocker stocks with Lupron and so on and so forth. And that's what they do is they use some really lax standards. Obviously, there are no longitudinal studies for this kind of thing with respect to the trans agenda in particular, because we've only been transitioning kids for a handful of years. So we're not going to know how it worked out for them as adults for a couple of decades yet. You can probably check out Matt Walsh for a little bit more on how it is that they're using sort of weak evidence and then laundering their conclusions through their peer groups for the sake of coming to the conclusion that they want. Let's see. I got a comment here. I'll throw to real quick. Darlene Cameron says, we have to take over the front lines and all fronts. Every single line must be secured ASAP before any more moves are made. We do not accept any foreign entity, group, countries, or agencies make or influence any laws or policies in the jurisdiction of Canada. Until the current Min is charged with espionage, all orders and laws are null and void by law. I wouldn't go that far. I don't think all orders and laws are null and void necessarily because our leadership is not following them. I can definitely empathize with the sentiment, though. I can remember people saying in Ottawa when they came in with the crackdown on 18 February, like if they're not going to follow the law, then why should we? And I believe that argument was being advanced for the purpose of convincing everybody to fight with the cops. But cooler heads prevailed in that situation, obviously, and there wasn't even so much as a punch thrown. I think we have a lot of house cleaning that we need to do, and I'm really eager to talk to Mark about that a little bit, because what he's been saying is that the Trudeau Must Go campaign is here we have Trudeau Must Go. This is the Civilian Intelligence Network 3.0. It's a pretty neat little website. So there are plenty of good reasons here why Trudeau must go. But the message that I'm getting from Mark is very much akin to what I've been putting out there on this show. And that is that Justin Trudeau is just the Wizard of Oz, guys. The man behind the curtain is the boomer. And that's the boomer hegemony, I mean to say. It's in the public service, it's in the institutions, it's everything from the public service to the universities, the police, the professional institutions. Obviously, the politicians are bought, so on and so forth. So it's the The generation that's at peak institutional power at this particular moment in our history, according to Strauss-Howe generational theory, as it has been since 2008 in the United States, and I would say maybe 2010 since in Canada, that's the boomer generation. So they're the ones who are kind of pulling the strings right now. And if you want to know who's on the other end of this particular duplicitous Ken doll of a marionette we have for a prime minister, that's who it is. That's who's whispering in his ear. It's the boomer generation, namely in the public service. And if you've been tracking, the the Public Order Emergencies Commission, you'll realize that it is the establishment, professional bureaucrat class, the senior bureaucrats that are the ones calling the shots. And he just listens to them. That's all. He thinks that he's one of the good guys, and these professional bureaucrats are also the folks who are, in the business of ruling Canada, so to speak. The folks in Ottawa and the professional bureaucrat class, they love him because he does whatever they want. And what you end up with is this kind of Hunger Games type scenario where the people in the major cities here are just kind of exploiting all the people in the rural areas as tax livestock. And in the East, I would say it's more like vote livestock. It's a really pernicious situation, I think, that we have constitutionally here in Canada, where we're draining resources from the West in order to buy votes in the East and pit us all against each other. So I'd be happy to hear some thoughts on that from Mark if he gets a chance to join us. So here's Trudeau must go. We got all kinds of good reasons why this guy should go, and I'm not saying that he doesn't have to go. I think he probably has to go off a long walk on a short pier. So many reasons that hashtag Trudeau must go. You have your personal vacation days, so you can go in there and check all that stuff out. SNSD Lavaland, Phoenix Pay System, Karaoke Groper, Attorney General Interference, Aga Khan, Island Vacation, John Kerry meets Justin Trudeau at the Aga Khan Island. Okay, so, and this goes on and on. So there are tons and tons of reasons why this guy really needs to go. But I think as people are starting to sense, they're probably just going to install somebody else in his place and pursue the same agenda because he's just a front man. He's just the face of it. In the theory of the fourth turning, Strauss-Howe generational theory that I'm always trying to advance here, it's Trudeau would fit the profile of a Gen Xer demagogue, and the Gen Xer follows the nomad generational archetype. And examples of nomad generational archetype demagogues in history would include Stalin and Mao. So that's, Mao led a cultural revolution in China in order to bring the CCP to power. And that's pretty analogous to what we're seeing here in Canada right now. It's Maoist, right? They go around shaming everybody and shame on you for embracing your cultural heritage and the system that you were born into, and you need to cast off all that original sin and embrace the one true faith of wokeism. So that's effectively what we have going on right now, as I see it, is Trudeau is effectively kind of a Maoist figure, but potentially Hitlerian as well, like I mentioned. But I think with what we're seeing right now, he's probably more akin to Mao so far, with the exception of him maybe not murdering us all. So anyway, a lot of times people are always kind of saying, because I smash on the boomers all the time, I'm always trashing them because they are the ones who are pulling the strings. They're the puppet masters. And so I think it's important to call that out. And it's not all of them, clearly. And I point to figures like Abraham Lincoln as a prophet generational archetype, and Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original Star Wars series. He's the good prophet archetype. And we have Jordan Peterson to point to these days as well. So there are the good ones. The problem in a fourth turning is that there are too few wise old men, I would say, too few strong leaders. And the theory is often distilled down to that old adage of strong men bring good times bring weak men bring hard times create strong men. And that is the cycle of Strauss-Howe generational theory in a nutshell. And so The strong men who brought good times at the beginning of the millennial saeculum, just following the Second World War, would have been the lost generation when they were at peak institutional power, leading the greatest generation, the GI generation, who came back from World War II and gave us our institution support, more steel and concrete than any other generation since. That ushers in the high. So those are the good times that create weak men. And the weak man in Strauss-Howe generational theory is the boomer, because the boomer was born in the wake of the Second World War when they were ushering in the new social high. And so let's see, what do we got here? Okay. This is, I got this queued up right on the spot that I want out here. So here, we'll just check this out.
Freeman Dyson told me, he said, well, just look around the world right now, it's greener. And yet then when I see that happen.
Okay, sorry, let me cue this up. So this guy here is Patrick Moore. He was one of the original founders of Greenpeace. I think he might talk about that in this segment here a little bit. And the thing about Patrick Moore, as you can see, he's a boomer, and he was right in there with all those hippies when they effectively co-opted the environmentalist movement and made it culturally Marxist, the same way they did with the civil rights movement, where, it's not the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King that lives on now, it's the legacy of Malcolm X. It's the more radical version, the culturally Marxist, anti-Western version of civil rights. And we see the same thing in the Green movement as well, okay? And it has everything to do with the fact that the boomers were moving from their early lives, their hippie lives, into a more into their midlives, which is where we all have peak political power. So as they're getting really active in their midlives politically, we see these movements kind of turning against us. So here's Patrick Moore explaining his experience with Greenpeace and why he left that organization that he co-founded.
Like
that's a proven fact.
Yeah, well, the reforestation or the regrowth in the Amazon has been phenomenal. Then I read comments in the New York Times like, well, it's ridiculous that this should have happened in the first place. You can't be like replanting or recovering from what was an environmental disaster by putting more carbon into the atmosphere. It was as though you cannot have good news. I find it quite remarkable. I get to the point where like the voices are so loud that I'm going, okay, how do I find where there actually is truth?
Well, where there's truth is that carbon is the basis of all life on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And where there's truth is that carbon dioxide is the source of that carbon for all life on Earth. And it's also true that for the last 600 million years, of which we have a reasonable record, CO2 has been declining in the global atmosphere to the point where at the peak of the last glaciation, when the oceans absorb more CO2 than they do when they're warm, it was cold, CO2 dropped to 180 parts per million.
Yeah.
And that is only 30 parts per million above the death of plants. And it is.
My understanding is that right now we're at about 400 or 480 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere.
It's surmised because there's an ash layer associated with these peaks in cold during the glaciations.
It's only 30 parts per million above the death of plants.
Yes, and it's very clear from my paper that I've just published that if we had not intervened by putting the balance back into the carbon cycle, which was out of balance, it's a really interesting story because it's life itself that has sucked the CO2 out of the atmosphere over the millennia and put it into fossil fuels, but that's a very minor part of it. Mm-hmm. The big part of it is what's called carbonaceous rocks, limestone, chalk, and marble. And those are the remains of shells of marine calcifying organisms. And the calcium carbonate is what those shells are made out of. Mm-hmm. The carbon in the calcium carbonate is from CO2 that the oceans absorbed from the atmosphere. And that is what we're fracking for oil and gas, are those marine deposits of the shells of coccolithophores, which are minute phytoplankton that learned how to build. Many marine organisms, it started 500 million years ago. Many marine organisms learned how to control calcification. Mm-hmm. Biomineralization is the general term for it. Our bones, for example, are a case of biomineralization. But we did it for our skeletal structure, so we could stand up. Mm-hmm. The reason marine organisms did it was to basically build an armor plating around themselves, like clams and mussels and coral reefs and crabs. All of these are calcareous, and the calcium comes from the seawater. The carbonate comes from the air and is dissolved in the water. And so these huge deposits of shale are actually calcium carbonate. They are the shells of those plankton. The oil and gas is the organic matter of the living plankton that died and fell on the bottom of the ocean. But 100 million billion tons of carbonaceous rock represent carbon dioxide pulled out of the atmosphere. And because the Earth has cooled over the millennia, nature is no longer putting CO2 into the atmosphere to offset this. So the curves are there to look at on the internet. You can see it. CO2 has been declining to where it is getting close to the end of plant life. And another 1.8 million years, if you just take that line and draw it straight down, another 1.8 million years, life would begin to die on planet Earth for lack of CO2.
Not because of an excess.
There is no such thing as an excess of CO2 under any real world circumstance.
Well, the message out there is pretty clear that there is such a thing.
No, there isn't. Because it's proven fact.
Well, there is in terms of human life. We suffocate under certain conditions. I can't remember how many parts per million. It's up there. We will suffocate. So we should probably acknowledge that there is an upper limit for human life.
For example, that greenhouse growers they actually buy CO2 in bottles.
Well, I know they pump it in.
They pump it in to get it up to 1,000 parts per million. The optimum CO2 level for plant growth, which when you think about it is the basis of all the animal life on Earth, every insect, every vertebrate, every invertebrate, all the things that are not plants depend on the plants for their existence. The sugars the plants produce through photosynthesis are the energy supply for the whole world. What are those sugars made out of? Water and carbon dioxide. And when you burn fossil fuels, which are the result of photosynthesis, what do you get? Water and carbon dioxide and some contaminants, which we know how to clean. But that's what basically comes out of the tailpipe is water and CO2. Plants take those two things and turn them into glucose, sugar, and everything else goes from there. So we should care about the plants. And if we cared about the plants, we'd put the CO2 up to 1,000, and it's only at 400 now. And actually,
okay, so that's the case that he's making. I'm not necessarily endorsing everything that he's saying, but I find it to be a very interesting case to consider. And I just I did a quick search here. Let's see if we can just drop that in there for you guys. But I want to show you a little bit of what he's talking about here. So here's our present temperature line here. This is the dashed line near the top of the screen. Let me give you a full screen view of that. Okay, so here's the dashed line, and this is our present temperature, and that's, I guess, average global. And it's way up here, but it's, something like, here are some little ice ages and stuff, but the present temperature is somewhere up around, what is that, -32? Something like that. What is this in? What scale is that in? I'm not sure. But the point here is that we're way up there, in terms of the historical norms. Historically, like, we've had these ice ages. Like, look at these freaking temperatures. My understanding, this would be Celsius. So this is -50 Celsius. So we're at like -32 now, and it was down to about -50 there during the Younger Dryas era. I've done some reading on this particular area and some other pursuits, I guess. I could recommend a book called The Cycle of Cosmic Cataclysms. It's got 3 or 4 authors to it, and it's a lot of geology and other stuff, sciencey stuff, very, very well referenced, lots of good pictures and diagrams and all kinds of stuff that talks about what happened during the Younger Dryas era. Now, the thing about this that I find interesting, so this is what he's talking about, okay? Like, as life extracts, as we breathe oxygen and trap carbon in our bodies through the process of calcification. In the case of land mammals, we have bones that are calcified, and through the process of fossilization, they become rock, and that's carbon dating, of course, that we use to date how old a fossil is, and that's what he's talking about. That's why they're fossil fuels, is because it is that calcified carbon that through the process of fossilization becomes the fuel that we use. And there's really, as far as I'm aware anyway, there's really no kind of reliable estimate as to how much fossil fuels we even have here on Earth, because we're kind of talking about all of the biomass that's ever existed on Earth, as Patrick Moore points out. Yeah, I mean, this all started about 500 million years ago during the Cambrian. So there could be like just untold reserves down there. And by trapping all that carbon, what ends up happening is life itself lowers the temperature. It's us, the oxygen breathing based life, and the carbon calcifying life that drops that, over the millennia, over thousands and thousands of years. Now, what we're looking at here is a time scale that goes from the year 0 back to about 15,000 BC. I've read some really interesting stuff that puts kind of the pyramids a little bit further back toward that era, namely that the Sphinx enclosure, it's carved out of bedrock. Most people don't know that. They think it's sitting on the sand, but it's actually carved out of the bedrock, and it was almost completely covered when Napoleon found it. Just the head was sticking up out of the sand. But the enclosure itself has signs of rain erosion that are such that they could not have occurred any later than, say, 10,500 BC, something like that. So here we see this 12,800 to 11,600 years before, whatever that is, before present. Right around that time, 11,500, 10,500 BC, that's where we're seeing kind of these enclosures. The original rock is being dated using geologic means. So there's a bit of an explanation required there, and I have a theory as to what's going on. I think it was basically the Atlanteans, and then what we see here is this drop in global temperatures. This is when we would have had ice in Canada up to about the level where the Cessnas currently fly. And the world that we live in right now was just the mountain ranges. Okay. The sea level would have been much, much lower. Like, I can't remember what it is in the book, but like 200 feet or something. It's not a small amount. And so what that means is that our coastline, as in where we build our cities all over the world for purposes of facilitating commerce and trade, the port cities, New York, Los Angeles, all that stuff, they're not where they are now. They're somewhere out nearer to the continental shelf, because the ocean was that far out around that time. So, we have the flood myth and all that stuff. I kind of think that's probably where it comes from. Richard Dawkins says that human beings have been around for about 200,000 years in their present form. So it kind of begs the question, like, how come it took 197,500 years for us to reach the stage of enlightenment, like Socrates? How do you know that? It's the first time it ever occurred to anybody to ask that question. Wasn't until about 350 BC. I'm skeptical. I think that we've kind of been through this process of, great stages of the Enlightenment and civilizational collapse over and over and over again. And it seems to me that the Strauss-Howe generational theory provides a pretty good explanation as to how that happens. But I digress. I just find this period right here to be very interesting. If you consider the fact that it's minus 50, but we're taking these temperatures, they're incorporating the ocean temperatures now, but they only just started doing that. So it's kind of hard for me to say, but I can't help but wonder if these temperature sensors are on land where it is currently. Well, during the Under Dryas, that would have been up in the mountain ranges where all the glaciers were, whereas the coastline would have been somewhere where the continental shelf is now. So if these are the temperatures here, and the ocean level is like 200 feet lower, well, this is kind of like putting a temperature sensor up 200 feet up a mountain and taking a temperature reading there, whereas at sea level, we could expect that the atmospheric pressure would have been a lot higher. It would have been 1 bar, like it is at sea level now. But it wouldn't have been close to 1 bar up here. It would have been further away from that. It would have been a lot less pressure. So That's where we see that. But anyway, so if you're gonna find cities during the Younger Dryas, my money's on the continental shelf, and in particular, probably around the Pacific Islands, like Indonesia and the whole Japanese chain there. I've seen Graham Hancock doing some scuba diving around those mountain ranges and finding underwater pyramids. So anyway, it seems to me like it's just a really nice, it's just a really neat aside, just kind of something else I'm interested in. And also I kind of think that Christianity is basically the religion that the Atlanteans bequeath to us. But back to the topic of the day, which is Mark Friesen, and he's a bit of a climate guy, as you can see. And I find Patrick Moore to be pretty reasonable once in a while. I think he's less than careful with his choice of words when he says, like, there is no limit to the amount of CO2 that the Earth can, manage. Well, yeah, but that's the Earth, and that's not humanity necessarily. So he does get some criticism out there, but I think he's definitely one of the guys that we need to be listening to right now, providing that alternative perspective, because all we're really getting from our institutions is lies.
It may not.
Okay, so what I wanted to talk about a little bit here was how, actually, you know what? Hang on a second. I'm going to go back to our friend Patrick Moore here, because he gets into a little bit about how the movement started.
Just due to the fact that there's only so much fossil fuel. But the other interesting thing is the carbonaceous rocks, limestone, that's what we make cement with. And when we make cement, about 5% of the CO2 emissions from humans today in this world is from cement production. By burning calcium carbonate and creating calcium oxide, which is lime, which is the major constituent of cement, and CO2 goes up. So we can actually burn lime with solar energy. By focusing solar heat onto lime, we can burn it. So even if we run out of fossil...
Okay, hang on a second here, guys. I am going to get out of that, because there's the PragerU video out there that's, I think is what I meant to tee up here. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull it up. See, what do we got? Here he is. Why I Left Greenpeace. So this is a good one too.
In 1971, I helped found an environmental group in the basement of a Unitarian church in Vancouver, Canada. 15 years later, it had grown into an international powerhouse. We were making headlines every month. I was famous, and then I walked out the door. The mission, once noble, had become corrupted. Political agendas and fear-mongering trumped science and truth. Here's how it happened. When I was studying for my PhD in ecology at the University of British Columbia, I joined a small activist group called the Don't Make a Wave Committee. It was the height of the Cold War. The Vietnam War was raging. I became radicalized by these realities and by the emerging consciousness of the environment. The mission of the Don't Make a Wave Committee was to launch an ocean-going campaign against U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska, a symbol of our opposition to nuclear war. As one of our early meetings was breaking up, someone said, "Peace." A reply came, "Why don't we make it a green peace?" And a new movement was born. Green was for the environment, and peace was for the people. We named our boat the Greenpeace, and I joined the 12-person crew for a voyage of protest. We didn't stop that H-bomb test, but it was the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. We had won a major victory. In 1975, Greenpeace took a sharp turn away from our anti-nuclear efforts and set out to save the whales, sailing the high seas to
So again, I'm drawing your attention to this because he's talking about right around this time, 1975. So he's a grad student. He's working on his, or I think he just got his PhD, right? And he's teaming up with his peer groups And that would have been the boomer generation around this time. So I think the pop culture kind of definition, or maybe it's the Pew definition of a boomer, is about 1945 to about 1965. And Strauss-Howe generational theory puts it more at like 41 to 61. And I think Bruce Cannon Gibney puts the boom at much longer. Like he uses some population statistics and stuff like that to kind of extend it out from about 45 to 67, which puts Freeland right on the line, having been born in 68, as somebody pointed out to me recently. Technically a Gen Xer, but fits the profile of a boomer female in my assessment right now. Anyway, so here's Patrick Moore. They would have been early 20s boomers, and they're taking up the cause of environmentalism.
Front Russian and Japanese whalers. The footage we shot, young protesters positioned between harpoons and fleeing whales, was shown on TV around the world. Public donations poured in. By the early 1980s, we were campaigning against toxic waste, air pollution, trophy hunting, and the live capture of orca whales. But I began to feel uncomfortable with the course my fellow directors were taking. I found myself the only one of 6 international directors with a formal science background. We were now tackling subjects that involved complex issues of toxicology, chemistry, and human health. You don't need a PhD in marine biology to know it's a good thing to save whales from extinction. But when you're analyzing which chemicals to ban, you need to know some science. And the first lesson of ecology is that we are all interconnected. Humans are part of nature, not separate from it. Many other species, disease agents and their carriers, for example, are our enemies, and we have the moral obligation to protect human beings from these enemies. Biodiversity is not always our friend. I had noticed something else. As we grew into an international organization with over 100 million a year coming in, a big change in attitude had occurred. The peace in Greenpeace had faded away. Only the green part seemed to matter now. Humans, to use Greenpeace language, had become the enemies of the earth. Putting an end to industrial growth and banning many useful technologies and chemicals became common themes of the movement. Science and logic no longer held sway. Sensationalism, misinformation, and fear were what we used to promote our campaigns. The final straw came when my fellow directors decided that we had to work to ban the element chlorine worldwide. They named chlorine the devil's element, as if it were evil. But this was absurd. Adding chlorine to drinking water was one of the biggest advances in the history of public health. And anyone with a basic knowledge of chemistry knew that many of our most effective pharmaceuticals had a chlorine component. Not only that, but if this anti-chlorine campaign succeeded, it wouldn't be our wealthy donors who would suffer. Wealthy individuals and countries always find a way around these follies. The ones who suffer are those in developing countries, people we're presumably trying to help. For example, Greenpeace has opposed the adoption of golden rice, a genetically modified variety of rice that contains beta-carotene. Golden rice has the potential to prevent the death of 2 million of the
Sorry, guys. Yeah. It looks like this video just kind of went for a dump on me here. But yeah, I think you guys get the idea. So what's happening with the Greenpeace movement is it becomes culturally Marxist. This is my assessment, essentially, and what we mean when we say culturally Marxist. is in Marxism, you have you have the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, and then you have the proletariat, the oppressed. And essentially what cultural Marxism does is it takes that economic pseudo-philosophy and applies it to culture. And so now we have everybody split into victims of varying degrees of victimization and sorry, I think I meant to say categories of varying degrees of victimization and of oppression, of oppressors. And in the case of the environment, of course, humans take the place of oppressors, and that's what we see is it's been radicalized, the environmentalist movement. And I'm just pointing out that this is a thing that happened under the watch of the boomers. Yeah, we kind of see this taking shape, I think, elsewhere in our institution, elsewhere in our institutions, especially with like a lot of the IPCC stuff. So that's the International Panel on Climate Change coming out of the UN. It's a lot of this kind of shaming and guilt tactics that we see the Maoists using for, we should be ashamed of being made out of carbon, but nobody can control how we were born, and we're just doing the best we can to play that hand that we were dealt. But so there's a kind of misology, I think, that's inherent to all these culturally Marxist movements. That's a big fancy word for anti-human, misology. I got a comment here. It says, check out Bjorn Lomborg's book, False Alarm, How Climate Change Panic Costs Us Trillions, Hurts the Poor, and Fails to Fix the Planet. That was actually, I referenced that book just a little while ago. Bjorn Lomborg is kind of the man for this stuff. Very sharp guy, and he's very data-rich writing. Also, Leonard Kingsley says the baby boomers were born between 1945 and 1965 when the baby boom ended. Yeah, that is Pew's definition, I believe, and the pulp culture definition. So that's probably the most widely known definition. I'm just pointing out that there are other theories out there. And Strauss-Howe generational theory is the one that I draw on the most. That puts it at about 1941 to 1961. And I think that Neil Howe argues that the boom actually started with GIs returning on their leave to returning from leave from the front and having babies while the war was on. I don't really find that, I don't know, I don't find that to be as compelling as the babies that were born and raised in the wake of the Second World War, because really, like, the social high and the mood, it doesn't change until 45. It doesn't become a bright future again until like 45, and that's really kind of that's what shapes the prophet generational archetype. Is this their personality is marked with a sense of idealism, and the things just kind of happen because they spend their lives coming up behind some of the greatest generations that have ever existed and riding a wave of economic prosperity set in motion by their elders, and they come up with a sense of things are just going to keep getting better, and they just happen. And so when they reach peak institutional power in their early elderhood, they tyrannize us with their ineptitude, having spent their entire lives just not doing their jobs. That's what I saw in the military, and that's kind of what I see happening across government of Canada. I spent 7 years at National Defence Headquarters in Ottawa, and I'm quite conversant in bureaucraties, fluent even. So that's my assessment for what it's worth. So moving on, what do we got here next? Oh, pardon me. This thing is going to be the bane of my show. Okay, that's going backwards. Okay, so yeah, we were talking a little bit about these different definitions, baby boomers, whether it's 45 or 65. This is Neil Howe's Twitter page. He is kind of the primary architect of Strauss-Howe generational theory. He's an economist and demographer, as in somebody who studies changing demographics. And you can see, like, this is the kind of stuff that he's into. It's all about like stats and data and particularly like investing, and he runs a lot of different stuff on hedge funds and things like this. And that's what they're doing, is they're hedging against the great crisis. He's trying to predict long-term market trends, and in his research he came across this idea that there are only 4 generational archetypes that just keep repeating over and over and over again throughout human history, and that it's always the generation born in the wake of the previous great crisis, usually a war, that grows up to tyrannize us and drive us back to total war in their early elderhood while they're at peak institutional power. So here we have, it might not be that easy to see on your screens, but there are two different lines. The orange line is a little more prominent, and that orange line is it's got S and H, okay? So by Strauss-Howe generational theory, the orange line shows you how these generational personalities essentially ebb and flow. It's like a wave, right? And this starts with the GIs being born, and here you have the boomers being born around 1941-ish is what they're saying. They adjusted to it, might be 43 now or something, but it's right around there. And the blue line is the wave produced by Pew Research. So that's the one that most people are more familiar with, and you can see that the blue line is kind of smack dab in the middle here, closer to like 45 to 65 or thereabouts. So it really kind of depends on how you define boomer, but I tend to pull from all the different definitions kind of depending on the individual that I'm trying to assess, because there's overlap on each sides of the line, okay? So just we're talking about social trends, not individuals, so it's a very broad approximation, and it kind of requires some analysis to really whittle down who's who when we get down close to these lines. But essentially what you have here is this is like the GIs. They would have been the one that won the Second World War and ushered in that new high here, and that's where the boomers are coming in. And what we have here is the high, and then there's the spiritual awakening. So that's what's happening in Patrick Moore's video. There is when the boomers come out into their early adulthoods for the spiritual awakening. So that would have been like the Woodstock era, and the Gen Xers are being born. The earliest Gen Xers would have been the Woodstock babies, the children that attended Woodstock, and they're raised as underprotected. So the boomers are raised as indulged, as in they get their way all the time. They weren't breastfed, and they were kind of left just flopping around in front of the TV for their entire infancy, with lead in the baby food and lead in those candy-colored paint chips, and lead in the gasoline, fluoride in the water, and you know, that's who's running your country right now. There's got to be some kind of impact to all that stuff, the lack of breastfeeding in particular, and that is the one that I zero in on the most. And then with the Gen Xers being born, you have this is what's known as the awakening. So the boomers are coming out, just gaslighting and terrorizing their elders, so they don't have to take any responsibility, and they can dodge, Vietnam, and they can dodge parenthood by raising their own kids under latch and key, and just kind of dragging them along to Woodstock. And so they're all kind of like me in the spiritual awakening. And so it's ironic, I guess, for a Gen Xer to hear the boomers going after the millennials like they're entitled. Because I was there, okay, in 2001, before 9/11 hit, and I saw what they were like in the pre-9/11 world, when we were just coming at the end of the decade of darkness, and essentially the Cold War era. They were when 9/11 hit, I saw those guys all scrambling for the beer tours and taking deployments to places like the Golan Heights and Cyprus, which is a well-known beach destination. So they would do that so that they would get, put on a DAG red list, as in they can't deploy again for at least 18 months after that. So these are jammy tours that they were taking so they wouldn't have to go to Afghanistan, because they were quite content to see all the kids coming up out of high school go off and do their dying for them. That's kind of the theme here, is that what happens when the boomers come into their early adulthood during the spiritual awakening, children are raised as underprotected. So during the high, the boomers are raised as indulged. During the awakening, the Gen Xers are raised as underprotected. That's the latchkey kids, Crips, Bloods, West Coast, East Coast, Mike Tyson, like the whole shebang. Okay, that was American History X, right? Like that was us back in those days. But we're not like that anymore. You see, that's kind of I think the boomers have maintained this perception that we're all a bunch of gangbangers and racists. But the fact of the matter was we were the children in that situation, and we didn't have anybody looking out for us. And so we ended up having to look out for each other. And what you end up with is a lot of polarization, and gang fighting, right? Because we all killed the shit out of each other back in the 80s and 90s. The judges actually said that we've lost a generation back then because we were just so god awful aggressive. But that wasn't our fault, and we're all grown up and over it now. But they still seem to think that we're all sort of white supremacists and gangbangers and stuff like that. But I digress. With the millennials being born, that's right around 1982. So that's the class of 2000. That's kind of a Strauss-Howe definition. It seems like the blue line is a little bit earlier there, right around 1980. I've seen it more like 85 for the millennials being born. And there's also this idea of a micro generation of the Xennials, the Gen Xers and the millennials, the Nintendo generation, the people who came on the scene with the technology and grew alongside it. We adapted to everything from home computers and home gaming systems to cell phones to the internet and all that stuff. It wasn't here when we got here, and we just kind of learned it as we went. I think that the resolution of the crisis, the leadership and the teamwork is going to be between the last wave Gen Xers, so everybody kind of born from 1970 onward, 1971 onward, and maybe even into the late 70s, and that overlaps with a lot of these early millennials going up to probably the late 80s. I think that the key to it all is kind of grunge music, because those were the guys that no record label would sign, because the idealistic boomer generation wants to hear kind of more happy-go-lucky stuff, and they weren't into our genre of music that we wrote about our depression. Those guys all kind of did it themselves, and the punk rockers were kind of the same way. And so it's that punk rock Seattle sound, those types that I think are really the anti-establishment, and the Gen Xers kind of made a whole identity around being the least full of shit generation possible, where gangster rap and all that stuff is really all about we want to make money, and we know how to do it, we're really good at it, and stuff like that. While it's a little bit too blusterous and boisterous for my taste, I think the general attitude is that we are who we say we are. We're not like you guys. We're not hypocrites, which is what the boomers have been called since they became the yuppies in the 1980s, because they were originally the hippies, and it was all anti-corporate and blah blah blah, and then they became the most superficial, cutthroat corporate generation ever, and basically chopped up all our corporations and sent them over to China. But I digress on that. I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of an idea of how this works. So you've got the boomers coming in during the social high. You've got the Gen Xers coming in during the awakening, where children are raised as underprotected. And then you've got the millennials being born, and right around 1981, I think, is when they actually started publishing books again that says you need to take care of your kids and do a good job, not just go after your career and never mind the kids, because that was kind of the writing during the 70s, right up until about 81. And so the millennials are kind of the golden boys. Everybody agrees that the boomers really screwed up when they were raising Gen X, and so Gen X and the boomers are put a concerted effort into raising these civic-minded millennials. They follow their hero archetype, which is the same as the GI generation that won the Second World War, and everybody says, "Oh yeah, right, they're so heroic and stuff." Well, it's because they're civic-minded. The lost generation was kind of the hard generation that won the First World War and led the Second World War. The GI generation were probably not as hard and rough around the edges as they were. They were a little bit more about the collared shirts and the swing music, So they were the good boys, and that was what the generals said about them in the early stages of the wars. They said they were the best damn kids that they'd ever seen. So that's the millennials. They're the best damn kids we've ever seen. This saculum. So I know I'm getting off a little bit on the Strauss-Howe stuff here, guys, but this is kind of what I lined up to talk to Mark about, so I might as well line this up a little bit. I'm just showing you guys here. This is the 4 turnings. This is from Life Course Associates. And I think it's just thefourthturning.com if you want to go check it out. There's lots of good resources there. It's a little bit difficult trying to muddle your way through it if you haven't really read anything or had it explained before. But yeah, here's the cycle kind of laid out. And if you look over here in the right column, it says time from one crisis climax to next crisis climax. So these are the different sacula. A saculum is a great year, it's what the ancient Greeks used to describe a great year, and they had a more cyclical view of time, where these harbingers and so on and so forth that we're trying to record in a lot of the stories that we tell, like Revelations, for example. The harbingers of coming collapse and tyranny and so on and so forth, that those keep recurring at regular intervals every 4 generations, and the time varies a little bit because it is such kind of a broad theory. But you can see here, right up coming around into the modern era, it's getting very regular. It's quite tightened down. And the thing about the American Revolution in particular, they dedicate a pretty big section on that, because the generation that was supposed to usher in the big high, the leaders coming back from the American Revolution, I'm not sure which generation that was, but they were effectively decimated. I think it was 600,000 lost in the American Civil War. That's something like 10 times every other conflict they've ever been in. That is by far their most bloodiest revolution, and was effectively genocide of the midlifers around that time, and of the well, not just the midlifers, but the soldiers as well. So there wasn't much left to rebuild on after that, but somehow they managed to pull off some pretty major accomplishments. And so sorry, I said American Revolution there, didn't I? But the Civil War, I was talking about the Civil War when I was saying how badly decimated they were with the 600,000 casualties. So you see a little bit of a variance here in some of these other things. Because of that, they explain that in their book Generations, and I think they talk about it again in the Fourth Turning. But you see, it goes like 82 years, 81 years, and they're looking at the 81 years as in, so 81 years, 1944, that's the peak of the previous Great Crisis. That's the climax. So that's the Second World War peaking, and they're saying it'll be another 81 years before we get to World War III, as we appear to now. So that's like 2026, as in the peaking of the crisis. And Neil Howe himself says that we'll be coming out of this crisis somewhere, well, the Americans will be coming out of this crisis somewhere between 2026 and 2030. So that marries very well. That lines up with everything that we see here. So, so he predicted that we would enter this crisis in the year 2020 plus or minus 2 years, and he was bang on. And so this is the guy that I'm kind of espousing out there now. And you can see that, it's at about those 80 to 90 year intervals that we re-enter these crises all the time. Okay, and here's just a quick something on the generations in history, and they follow them all the way back. And this is, again, their theory. This isn't Pew Research or anything. This is going way back. And here's our current. These are the current actors: Boomer generation at peak institutional power, Generation X at middle power, which is peak political power, and middle managers in the institutions. And the millennial generation is coming of age. So the youngest millennials are like 18. And every time the hero generation, the hero prophet generational archetype is coming of age, that's when we're going off to total war. So here's just a basic little background here. It says the prophet, born between 1943 and 1960. Okay, so this document is a little bit different. Like I said, they adjust here and there depending on whatever new data they've uncovered, I guess. And it says this generation basked as children in Dr. Spock's permissiveness, suburban conformism, beaver cleaver friendliness, and father knows best complacency. From the summer of love to the days of rage, they came of age rebelling against the worldly blueprints of their parents, even as they proclaimed themselves flower power arbiters of public morals. Youth pathologies worsened, and SAT scores began a 17-year slide. In the early 1980s, many young adults became self-absorbed yuppies with mainstream careers but perfectionist lifestyles. In the early 1990s, they entered midlife and national power, trumpeting values and visions, touting politics of meaning, and waging scorched earth culture wars. Today, they're next world blighted by the Great Recession. Most boomers are postponing retirement and preparing for an elderhood in which wisdom and meaning will have no substitute for creature comforts. And that sounds about right. They give a little bit. I mean, they're all kind of holed up in their gated communities with Barack Obama and Martha's Vineyard with however many millions of gallons of fuel that he needs to survive the apocalypse comfortably. It's interesting to take note of the fact that the SAT scores plummeted under the boomers because on account of the permissiveness of Dr. Spock, the indulgence of the children born in the wake of the previous crisis, because we're building these great institutions in this great society for the children, and it's all for you. And they kind of go, oh, all for boomer? Now, yeah, it's all for boomer. The Dr. Spock permissiveness leads to these self-absorbed, self-righteous, narcissistic youths that just go out there kind of telling everybody else what to do and how terrible they are. What do they do when they reach, midlife? Well, they completely flop and get called hypocrites in the opinion articles, opinion pieces, because well, they clearly were not genuinely concerned with world peace, because ever since they reached their midlives, it's been nonstop war, war on terror and the whole shebang. So here we see the boomers: Hillary Clinton, George and Laura Bush, Steve Jobs, Cornel West, Robin Williams, and foreign include Tony Blair and Benjamin Netanyahu. So it kind of reads like a who's who of Bohemian Grove and worshiping the giant owl. And the prophet generation, I should point out, is so named because they're the ones who found our religions. And in this saculum, it's postmodernism, or what's known in the pop culture as wokeism. That's what we see right now, is their peak institutional power, essentially reigning in a new theocracy with these puritanical standards for the rest of us, based on nobody knows, right? Because that's how postmodernism is it's really all kind of about the so-called experts' feelings. And then we have Generation X. We follow the nomad. So this is right here, Generation X, nomad archetype. We're the second generation after the previous Great Crisis, which is the World War II in this case. So they say born 61 to 81. I think Axl Rose would have been 61. There's a little bit of that anti-establishment bent coming in right there, like anti-institutional in particular. That's something the nomad is marked by. But that's the first wave of Gen Xers. I think it's important to make a distinction here, because I think what's happening is the nomad demagogues that I talked about, the Maoist types like Trudeau, they seem to be more like the elder Gen Xers. So they would have been the ones who kind of missed out on the Seattle Sound stuff. And they're hypocrites. They're sellouts. Okay. So think Metallica, right? As soon as they got a little taste of that pop culture cash with the Black Album, they totally sold out. And another one, Rage on Behalf of the Machine, right? So they used to be all about, taking down the man and the machine and all this stuff. And now they're telling us all to put on a mask and take the jab. So the first wave Gen Xers are kind of split. Like, a lot of them are really great, but it's kind of split down the middle because they were left on their own with the boomers for too long. So they've by and large been corrupted. And so that's what you see is in the first wave Gen Xers, a lot of them are just sellouts and functionally boomer. They've been boomerized. And it's kind of when you get into the last wave, the last wave Gen Xers that are a little bit more in the punk rock, Seattle Sound genres, that we kind of start to see the people that are a little less concerned with what everybody thinks about them. And we were known for sort of self-styling as freaks and putting on, the plaid, and then later becoming, hipsters and so on and so forth, because it's just the antithesis of all of this snobbery and elitism that we see in our next elders. And that is kind of what's at the center of it all, the center of it all here, folks. The analogy I remember that everybody used to use back in the day was the pendulum swinging, the political pendulum swinging from left to right. And we're seeing a great shift right now, and so on and so on. I never really liked that analogy because the pendulum swings under the force of gravity, but in real life, the pendulum is being moved by people. You know, it takes people kind of getting out and being active to move the pendulum in the direction that they want it. But what I realized after getting a little bit more conversant with Bill Howe and Neil Howe, or sorry, Bill Strauss and Neil Howe's work, is that the force of gravity that's pulling that pendulum back and forth is demography. Okay, what happens is essentially each generation goes out into their early lives trying to course correct for what they perceive to be the excess wielding of the parents' midlife power. So with the case of the boomers, their parents would have been the GI generation, so they made them out to be Archie Bunker on the tube, and I have a sense that that's kind of still what they believe about them to this day, but it's grossly exaggerated in my view. They were just kind of you know, candid and macho, and that's what we see is the boom generation is the one that went in completely the other direction and has been waging a war on machismo ever since, and really like machismo on its own. I know it's like a dirty word now. But on its own, like you can, it's like a Latin word, you know, and Spanish guys would they take a lot of pride, and you know, Mexicans and Portuguese are quite macho, and they take a lot of pride in being quite macho, particularly in cases like where you have, you know, these migrant farmers that you know will cross the border into the United States and pick a bunch of crops in California and sleep on the side of the highway so they can send a bunch of money back to their family at their home in Mexico, and they probably spend something like a month out of the year or 2 months out of the year at their home themselves, but they take a lot of pride in that stuff because they're macho. So it's not to say that machismo is good or that it is bad. I think that on the whole it is good. And maybe it's, you know, but it's open to criticisms. Anyway, it's essentially our ancient philosophies of stoicism and cynicism embodied in a Western male. I would say that's effectively what machismo is. And so it's this attack on machismo is very much an attack on Westernism and on our founding philosophies of stoicism and cynicism and of you know, rationalist enlightenment philosophy more recently. So it says Generation X is the nomad archetype. This generation survived a hurried childhood of divorce, latchkeys, open classrooms, devil child movies, and a shift from G to R ratings. They came of age hearing themselves denounced as so wild and stupid as to put the nation at risk. As young adults maneuvering through a sexual battlescape of AIDS and blighted courtship rituals, they dated and married cautiously. In jobs, they embraced risk and preferred free agency over loyal corporatism. From grunge to hip hop, their splintery culture revealed a hardening edge. Politically, they have leaned towards the pragmatism and non-affiliation and would rather volunteer than vote. That's very true. I do both, but I think if you vote, you might get suckered, but if you help the homeless, well, you're never going to regret it, right? I think that's kind of the attitude amongst my peers. I've always voted, though. Today, entering midlife battered by an economic hardship, they ascended to political and corporate leadership roles, feeling less like hailed winners than like resilient survivors, seeking out safe harbors for the sake of themselves and their families. So that sounds like this document was written quite a while ago. So I think that sounds right about right for those of us in our midlives right now, as we get to deal with a full-blown global crisis right in time for our midlife crises. And we just kind of got to keep our heads down and power through it because that's what we do, the nomad. We have to come up in the wake of the prophet, basically scrounging for whatever scraps of wealth and social cohesion are left in their wake. And then we have the millennials. That's the hero generational archetype. The previous hero generational archetype was the GI generation, as I mentioned. born 1982 to 2004. That's about the definition that I use most broadly. I give them some leeway on the early end there because of that exennial micro generation that I noticed. Like my sister was born in 82, but she's a lot more Gen X than she is millennial. My son's a millennial and he loves his collared shirts and buttons and stuff like that. And my sister is not like that. So that's kind of a distinction. Okay. It's the good kids and the bad kids. At least that's how we're perceived. So the millennials, this generation first arrived amid babies on board signs when abortion and divorce rates ebbed. The popular culture recast babies as special, and hands-off parental styles were replaced by Lamaze and attachment parenting obsessiveness. Child abuse and child safety became hot topics, while books teaching virtues, values, and team-playing citizenship became bestsellers. As millennials began reaching their teens in the late 90s, youth volunteering and community service surged, while teen rates of drinking, smoking, and violent crime declined steeply. As they began entering the workforce in the early 2000s, cutting-edge employers implemented safety, feedback, mentorship, and career advancement programs in order to retain their best and brightest. Today, even as they live with their nearby parents, first-wave millennials maintain high hopes for their future in the face of record-high youth unemployment. And they did just get turned into a permanent renting class when the Canada Pension Fund and hedge funds went out there during the early pandemic and started scooping up all the residential property so that they could pay those boomer pensions. And that is what it all goes back to, guys, is we can't pay the boomer pensions, the entitlements programs that they've mismanaged. There's what is it, $1 trillion in unfunded liabilities that the Canada pension fund's up to right now, since they restructured it in the 90s. And they're all punching out, and we're kind of left holding the bag for that $1 trillion to pay for those retirements, when really, they didn't pay for their wars and any number of other things. So that's just kind of, I just want to give you a little bit of a little more in-depth dive as to what we're dealing with here in the fourth turning. So again, it's that prophet nomad and hero archetype, from oldest to youngest, participating in our institutions, and at this current moment in our history, that's boomer, Gen X, and millennial. So the generational diagonal, I can kind of read this because I'm a little bit more familiar with it. But what you can see here is here we have 1920, and they're showing how each age group is perceived in the social order. And so here we have 1920. Elders are seen as sensitive. Midlifers are seen as moralistic. You know what? I'm going to read this left to right. So in 1920, we see that elders are seen as sensitive. In 1941, they're seen as visionary. In 1962, they're seen as reclusive. And in 1983, they're seen as busy. But then back to 2004, we see they go back to being sensitive. Okay, so why is that happening? It's because this generation that was at peak institutional power back in 1920, coming out of the Second World War, leading into the Great Depression and eventually the Second World War, those elders were seen as sensitive. So that was the prophet generational archetype. Would have been the missionary generation for that one. And the untold story of the Second World War is that the missionary generation that led us into the First World War, gave us the Great Depression, and led us back into war with the Second World War. They are not the same generation as the generation that led us out of World War. So out of the Second World War. So the sensitive elder is too self-righteous and narcissistic to be trusted with power over other people. And even though he didn't go to war himself, he still expects the rest of us, when he was young, that is, he still expects the rest of us to be utterly subservient to his whims resulting from every failed attempt at diplomacy. That's what they do. They fail to engage in diplomacy. They polarize and double down on their adversaries. We saw this, going into the Second World War with a lot of righteousness and zealousness around, like say what were the accords that they signed after the First World War? The one that Germany basically, it was too restrictive on Germany anyway. It's escaping me right now. But anyway, that was a lot of the uncompromising kind of leadership that we saw that led us right back into the Second World War. But the elders that led us out of the Second World War were the visionary types. Let me make sure if I got this. Yeah, that's right. We're seen as visionary. So what's interesting about this is that we can see from each era to each era, our elders, they're changing, right? So we go from sensitive elders to visionary elders to reclusive elders to busy elders back to sensitive elders, okay? So that doesn't really make a lot of sense. That's kind of what they noticed. And I think it had everything to do with the child being seen as pure or something. There was a child archetype that in Jungian theory, Jung had extrapolated something like several dozen archetypes that just keep repeating throughout all of our literature. But Strauss and Howe came back and said, actually, there are 4 archetypes. And what Jung had done is he had observed them each at different stages of their lives. So there's no such thing as the child archetype, because if you could look down here in the child row, in 1920, they're seen as protected. In 1941, they're seen as suffocated. 1962, indulged. 83, criticized. And in 2004, we're back to protected. So, you know, children, there is no child archetype. Children have different archetypes in different eras, right? And so that was what kind of clued them into this. But if we look at this same thing on a diagonal, okay, let's just start down here with the protected. Okay, in 1920, children are raised as protected, and then in 1941 we see the young adult heroic. Okay, so this is the GI generation being raised as protected. They turn out heroic in their young adulthood, powerful as midlifers, and busy in their elderhood. And they were the first generation to be referred to as senior citizens because they were still so active in society as elders. So that's what you see happening here. The thing is that we all start out at a different point in life, and that's all right down here on the bottom row. Okay, so how we turn out as adults depends on how we're raised. Whether we're raised protected, suffocated, indulged, or criticized depends on that's going to set us on the path for the rest of our life. So we follow the protected path. It goes from protected to heroic, powerful, and busy. So that seems like a pretty good template for raising kids, to raise them as protected. I think it's probably a little bit more of a combination of things, but that's for another live stream. And you see here in 1941, this would have been the silent generation. They're still around now. They were the Korean War veterans. They fought the Korean War when they were coming of age. So they're raised as suffocated because they're being reared during the previous crisis. And it's a lot of, your elders are doing an awful lot and sacrificing an awful lot for you, and you better do as you're told and, get under those desks like they're going to protect you from a nuclear fallout and so on and so forth. And we see that happening again right now, right? What are they doing? They're enlisting the kids to prosecute this battle on COVID, forcing the masks onto them and coercing them into taking vaccines. And clearly it's all very wrong. So I think it's worth kind of revisiting a lot of what we understand about the history of the Second World War in light of what we see right now, I would say. So anyway, the children who were raised during the Second World War, they're raised suffocated. They become conformist as young adults, going off and fighting the Korean War with no fuss, no muss, even though they were drafted. They become indecisive as midlifers, and then sensitive as elders. So they would have been at peak institutional power, as you can see right here in 2004. And that was when they were running things when 9/11 hit. And that was a hell of a lot scarier than what we're dealing with right now. And they didn't go anywhere near as far as the boomers went with the current crisis. And I'm making the case basically that it's because they're a war veteran generation, and they have a kind of appreciation for they're a little more connected with human suffering, I think, and what a lot of this bad decision making can do to people, especially at the lower rungs of our society, because that's something we all kind of experience as privates, corporals, stuff like that, just sort of getting tossed around by your leaders and having to live with whatever decisions are being made. So yeah, that's your silent generation. Started out as suffocated, became conformist, went to indecisive as midlifers, and finished out as sensitive. But they didn't tyrannize us. And then after the silent generation, 62, we have the boomer generation coming in. So children are raised as indulged. That's the Dr. Spock, Leave It to Beaver, perfect little alfalfa and little bastards. No matter how much they smoked and how many teen pregnancies they caused, they were still kind of seen as these little golden children of the future and blah, blah, blah. And the SAT scores dropped dramatically by about 30%, I think, while they were writing in them, and then didn't recover until Gen X started writing them. But the grades that they got in school were like straight A's, whereas we were like C students because we were seen as bad kids. So yeah, the boomers start out as indulged. They become narcissistic as young adults. Okay, so they're the only generation in the history of the United States to dodge the draft. The draft is in the United States as something of a coming of age for young men, and it's seen as just that. It's seen as a rite of passage into manhood, and that's how they market it. Even a man's got to do what a man's got to do, right? So they apparently saw no need to undergo the same process of character development or take up the same level of responsibility for the legacy that we've inherited as every other living generation has done in Gen X, millennial, and silent, and what's left of the GIs. So anyway, I kind of got to wonder where some of these folks get off having refused that rite of passage as early as young adults, now driving all these they're gearing up to drive the millennials and Gen Z into the meat grinder of history, becoming nuclear shadows over in Europe, because they just won't stop poking that Russian bear that the GI generation was so careful to protect the boomers from when they were fighting age. So moving on from the boomers, we see around 1983 that children are raised as criticized. So that's the Gen Xers. And I mentioned something about the moviegoers and stuff in one of those previous paragraphs, but we were portrayed in movies as, The Exorcist, Children of the Corn, Rosemary's Baby, so on and so forth. And then we saw that flip in 1982, where now we've got like Baby on Board signs, 3 Men and a Baby, and Look Who's Talking Now. And so there was a return to people liking babies after Gen X after Gen X started aging into adulthood. Once we kind of came up and people realized how aggressive we were, they said, okay, well, clearly we've screwed up and we need to fix this with the millennials. So we're starting out as criticized, gangs, Crips, Bloods, West Coast, East Coast, all that stuff, okay? We come into young adulthood, alienated. So that's your Seattle Sound and your punk rock, your freaks, who basically create an identity that is entirely intended to be the antithesis of what their hypocritic parents are. So we go from being criticized to alienated in young adult, and we have to go back here to see when the previous alienated generation was. Well, that was 1920. That was the lost generation. Those are the guys who won the First World War. I remember reading how at the turn of the century, in New England or in the United States, there somewhere, they were looking at some statistics about children getting run over in the streets, and apparently it was no big deal if you ran over a child in the streets around that time, and people wouldn't even stop their cars to pick a child up off the streets, and people would pass them by in the streets because they were seen as kind of a nuisance and as pests and as bad kids, and they were the black boots and the coal miners and the newsies that entered the workforce younger than any other generation on record, and what we see happening is kind of a repetition of that. Now, Gen X didn't have it as hard as the lost generation did. They didn't make us coal miners, but we did have double the rate of child abuse, double the rate of child neglect, double the rate of murder under 5, and we did enter the workforce at a younger age than any other living generation. And we had the highest rate of homelessness for adolescents, so on and so forth. So you can see, like, you know, as time goes on, like, things improve, but it's not a steady climb. It's like, you know, there's an advancement and a regression, and there's 2 steps forward, 1 back, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the way the cycle goes. So these lost Jenners, who would have also been raised as criticized, would have been the Newsies and the Bootblacks, like I mentioned. They come of age as alienated, but they were the kids who were getting run over in the streets at the turn of the century. And I remember reading how in 1920, in the 1920s time, when we're looking at children raised as protected, so between the 1920s, from the turn of the century, where there were running kids over and not caring, to the 1920s, when anybody who ran over a child in the streets would get lynched. What explains that difference? Well, the thing is that the generation that was run over in the streets at the turn of the century grew up. And so they have this connectedness to the kind of suffering that humans endure when they're being exploited and oppressed and treated like livestock. And so what do? They start lynching anybody who would run over a child without regard. And that's kind of what we see. Okay, that's what this is, the dynamic, the back and forth, the Ouroboros, you know, the snake eating its own tail, is basically like, yeah, they destroy what the GI generation tore down, and we come behind them, kind of cleaning up their scraps, what the hero generation tore down. And it's all about course correcting for our elders. That's what we do. When we come into our young adulthoods, we perceive ourselves as sort of being on this crusade to course correct. We're never going to be like that. We're never going to be like that. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, right? So, yeah, they go from being criticized to alienated to pragmatic midlifers, 45 to 65 around 1941. So you're talking about the lost generation who were the troops in World War I becoming the midlife leaders of World War II. But the people at peak institutional power at this time are still the visionaries. So that's the prophet generation again. And what happens between 1941 and 1945 is that these midlifers get older and they displace the visionaries from peak institutional power. And what we end up with is a reclusive elder that is actually the one who leads the institutions to resolution of the crisis. And a good example of that would have been the Civil War era. Those leaders actually became the kind of what do you call it, mountain men of the post-Civil War era. They just kind of became really reclusive and became went back into the wilderness, and basically, like, we're the ones that just kind of like don't expect anything from everybody, or don't ever expect anything from anybody. You guys leave me alone. I got this. And that's kind of the attitude that we see with us. Yeah, okay, I talked about this is the millennial life cycle. Well, it's actually the GI life cycle right here. And that's going to be the same for the millennials. They start out as protected, as young adults, they become heroic, powerful midlifers, busy elders. Okay, so that's what you're in for here, millennials. And with the artist archetype, that's going to be Gen Z. They're not here yet. Or they haven't come of age yet. They're still in school. Indulged, that's boomer. Okay, so they start out as indulged, narcissistic young adults, moralistic midlifers. That would have been like they came after us for our heavy metal, like it was all Satanist, and there was like a freaking inquisition for Major League Baseball over steroid abuse. And it's like, you guys were on LSD and cocaine, okay? Like, we're just playing sports. So yeah, again, you see that kind of hypocrisy where they were a hedonistic Orange Fest in their early adulthoods, and basically crushed Mexico into powder and put it up their noses. But where the Gen Xers were kind of playing sports and doing steroids, and somehow these smelly dope smoking hippies felt like they were in a position to lecture the rest of us on our drug scruples, I guess. Anyway, I rant, guys. Pardon me. So they go from being indulged, narcissistic, moralistic midlifers to the moralistic to the visionary elders. And you can see, oh, it's all modern monetary theory and Great Reset and all this stuff. Every crisis is another opportunity to usher in their vision of the utopia. And finally, we have the protected generation. Oh, sorry. The criticized generation, the children who start out criticized, the bad boys like Bart Simpson, and the kids of South Park. Okay, that's Gen X. So they start out criticized. Young adults, they're alienated and pragmatic as midlifers, and we're reclusive as elders. I'm actually kind of following the Strauss-Howe path here, where the previous nomad generation actually retired, after winning the Second World War with, I think it was something like very few of them had any more than 2 bedrooms in their house. I'm in a 1-bedroom house right now. I'm going mortgage free and getting ready for the big collapse here. Let's see. Okay, so before I get into this chart, because I know it's very busy, and maybe I'll just kind of zoom in a little bit here. Let me see. I'll throw to a couple of questions here because I don't want to lose you guys. So let's see. We got Leonard Kingsley. How do we account for the LGBTQ++, BLM, Antifa, woke, etc.? So they're basically all different heads of the same hydra. I mentioned that the prophet generational archetype, which is currently the boomers, is the one that is so named for founding our religions. So what happens is when the prophet reaches its elderhood, they rein in the new theocracy and they tyrannize us. And so that's why we see things like the Salem witch trials, the Inquisitions, where the institutions are effectively co-opted and turned against us. And the Lutheran revolt would have been an example of a good example of a fourth turning, where we came out on the good end of it, right? So every fourth turning, we have the potential to either fall to tyranny or usher in the next era of the Enlightenment. And the Lutheran revolt would have been a pretty good example of how the midlifer, because that's what Luther was he was a midlifer, and what did he do? He nailed his thesis to the door and said, "I know that you guys are lying," right? And that's kind of what's happening right now. We're going after them and saying like we know this is BS and that is BS, and we're looking for receipts and stuff like that. So it's basically a repetition of the same crisis. It's a leadership crisis where the leaders are inept and corrupt, but the midlifers are very pragmatic, and we're trying to sort this thing out, and we end up getting crucified for it. Okay, just like on Salem Hill, they hanged us during the Inquisitions, roasted us on the gridiron, and going back to the early Enlightenment, you can look up a guy. Giovanni Gentile was burned at the stake, a great man of the early Enlightenment, so on and so forth. So the thing is that they invent new religions, okay? I think Constantine and the Council of Nicaea would have heard a pretty good example of that, where they consolidated a lot of the different religions that were scattered around the Roman Empire into the Roman Catholic Church. The LGBTQ, BLM, Antifa, woke is all basically, I could essentially describe all of that as culturally Marxist organizations, okay? And cultural Marxism is basically the pop culture vernacular for postmodernism. And postmodernism is a counter-Enlightenment pseudo-philosophy that basically says, well, yeah, truth, empirical reality is kind of unknowable, and there's a deeper sort of more emotional reality that only these experts, hermeneuticists, I think they call it, the hermeneutics of postmodernism is absolutely just mind-bending, and it's a scam. Okay, it's pseudo philosophy. It's very clearly just truth is whatever I say it is kind of stuff, and we see that across the ages in these different religions. If you want to take a second look maybe at some of the earlier religious texts, like the Old Testament in particular, wherever you see that elder prophet figure who's represented as as an old man with a long gray beard, be it Yahweh, Moses, Abraham, Muhammad. It's hard times for the rest of us. And what do we see happening? We see famine, pestilence. We see we're being driven off to total war, civilizational collapse, Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, that's a fourth turning. Lot is the best man apparently in Sodom that's selected by God to survive. And he ends up impregnating his daughters in the cave, I think, where he's taken his visions, which, if I'm correct here, is probably just some earlier form of hallucinogen. It seems like the prophet generations are pretty big on the hallucinogens, so that's all. I mentioned the rape of Lot's daughters because I've often said that you see Aldous Huxley really zeroed in on the sexualization of children as a constituent of tyranny, and he really explored sort of the tyranny of the pleasure, where everybody is just kind of doped up all the time to make them happy regardless of circumstances, and we lose our humanity in the process, I think, is the lesson of the book. Yeah, so the sexualization of children is something that seems to keep recurring with these fourth turnings. And I remember being shocked the first time I read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, where he talks about his father, the emperor, having put an end to the pursuit of boys. And that was back then at the fall of the Roman Empire. So so the LGBT, I'm losing myself again, but the LGBTQ++, BLM, Antifa, woke, all that stuff is culturally Marxist. And the LGBTQ++ is really just sort of an extension of the original cultural Marxism. It's just that now it's like they're eating each other. They're eating each other into these smaller and smaller categories of tribes. And, now they're even talking about getting rid of the G from the LGBTQ++ stuff because white men don't really suffer any oppression, even though they're the ones that were getting beaten to death outside of the gay clubs back in the late 70s, early 80s. But I digress. That's what it is. It's these are all just sort of offshoots of the same dogma, the same central dogma of cultural Marxism, aka wokeness, aka postmodernism. So I'm going to go back to a little bit about the generations here. So we see in our chart, I have, let's see, we have our archetypes here at the top: hero, artist, prophet, and nomad. And they list all the different generations throughout history that fit into those, or, not all of them, but a lot of them. And so you can follow these all the way back. So if you look at nomad, Generation X is the current one, previous is lost. The Gilded Generation, which would have been, and this is something else that's interesting, okay? So the Lost Generation, that's the generation of George Orwell and Aldous Huxley and Ernest Hemingway and a lot of these great authors who came through the crisis with this kind of insight into the human condition never before seen. Well, if you dial the clock back a little bit further to the Gilded Generation, who do you find there? Well, it's Mark Twain, right? And for those of you who don't realize this, the tales of Tom Sawyer are basically just stories about Mark Twain's childhood. So he was raised as underprotected, and he lived through the Civil War era, and he's the guy who said that history may not repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And I've read some other things that he's read about just the low regard for human life around the time that I guess he would have been not just coming of age, but perhaps moving into early adulthood, moving into midlife. He talks about like boat racing on the Mississippi, where they drove those steam engines so hard that they would blow up the boat, and then the boat that remained unexploded would all cheer and clap for the falling body parts all around them. Yeah, I mean, we have a very dark nature, folks, and every time we go into one of these crises, it has that potential to kind of drag us all back to hell. So the Gilded generation, that would have been, like I said, that would have been the Mark Twain generation. So from Mark Twain to Ernest Hemingway, I think that's interesting that we get a lot of these, because these are the kind of dumb kids too that don't do so well in school and all that, but then they turn out to write these great literary masterpieces. So that's something I'm kind of exploring as well. And here on the prophet, we have the boom. The previous generation would have been the missionary generation. So that would have been FDR. FDR led us into World War II, but it was Truman, who was a lost gener, who let us out. Okay. And then you can go back transcendental. Okay. So that's not all terribly important, but what we see here is some details about the life cycle. Okay, so each one of these columns is essentially a life cycle, and you have the nomad life cycle, the prophet life cycle, and the artist life cycle, and the hero life cycle as such. And so this is very much in line. It's just a little bit more detailed with what we saw previously. So the artists, the millennials, they're seen as children as good, coming of age, empowering. Primary focus coming of age is outer world. Like I said, they're civic minded. They come of age during the what's called the unraveling. So that's like the post 9/11 era, with a sense that things are really headed in the wrong direction and something needs to be done, but they don't really know what that is yet, but they want to help. So young adulthood, they're building, transitioning into midlife. They will be energetic to hubristic. I guess I could see that with the millennials. And they are reaching midlife right now, with the oldest ones coming in at about 40, I think. Yeah, I mean, or maybe 39. I think Brendan Miller, I'd put him maybe around that category right there. So that's kind of where we are. Is transitioning into midlife. We got the hero. They're going from young adulthood, from building to energetic to hubristic. Now, for the nomads, I found this to be a little bit too on point. Here we are transitioning into midlife. So this is the fourth turning. Okay, we're in midlife. We're going into the fourth turning, feeling frenetic to exhausted. Does that sound about right to you guys? I know that sounds about right to me, because that was right about the time that I was getting released from the military due to my failing mental health. Yeah, I was pretty damn spent. So we also have, I'm going to take this from the fourth turning perspective. We have these frenetic to exhausted midlifers. And we're also going to have these righteous, austere, early elders that are leading us, while we have sensitive, hold on, hang on, we have sensitive children. Where's the artist? They are children, so they would be placid, just getting shoved around into these different masks and all this stuff. We have one more that we haven't mentioned here. No, we haven't. Okay, yeah. So we have these righteous, austere elders, frenetic to exhausted midlifers, these building hero archetypes as young adults, and placid artist archetypes being children. So if we come down here a little bit, this is something that I find that is interesting as for our current purposes of navigating the current crisis. We have here we have the different reputations. Okay, so positive reputation for the Gen X generation is that we're savvy, practical, and perceptive. Okay, so we're kind of those street smart, gangster Tom Sawyer kids. We're quite. We see ourselves as being quite pragmatic, quite accepting of reality, and quite good at navigating it. So that's our positive reputation. Now, our negative reputation is that we are unfeeling, uncultured, and amoral. And that fits very well with what they said about the lost generation before they went off to World War II. I believe the terms of imbecile and retard were invented just for the purpose of describing the new recruits from that generation while they were writing the entry exams for the military. But they turned out to be, they won the Great War and they led the greatest generation in the Second World War. And so it's a bit of an underdog story, I think. Now, our endowments include liberty, survival, and honor. Okay, so the drawback here, the unfeeling, uncultured, amoral. Like I said, we're aggressive. We're seen as unfeeling, but I think it's more like stoic. Okay, it's not that we don't feel things. It's just that we can't really engage with our feelings because it would destroy us. So, you know, that's kind of what we see with a lot of veterans too. You know, we don't take the meds to keep us from hurting other people. We take them to keep us from thinking about killing ourselves, right? Anyway, you don't want to engage with those kinds of feelings, and so we've learned to kind of set our feelings aside, having to come up hard during the era of latchkey kids and so on and so forth. So that's my defense there. But we have savvy, practical, perceptive Gen Xers that are seen as unfeeling, uncultured, and amoral. That's mostly because we swear the most. Our attributes include liberty, survival, and honor. So what we're up against here is the profit generation archetype. That's the boomers that are currently running our institution, and they have a positive reputation of being principled, resolute, and creative. Frankly, I don't know how they get the reputation of being principled, having spent 20 years in the military with them. And I'll point out, okay, like the Somalia affair concluded that the boomers needed to be given an ethical code of conduct. The current defense ethics program is essentially the result of the boomers' demonstrable need for principles. That's all I have to say about that. I don't know where they get this principled reputation. It must be from the millennials. I think that's what it is. The millennials kind of see them as being, you know, super awesome or something like that. And there's a kind of cultural partnership that takes place between the millennials and the boomers. Okay, this is how you end up with the witch hunts, is because when the profit generational archetype is reigning in, the new theocracy and everything's falling apart because they don't have any skills, can't lead. What they do is they scapegoat. Okay, that is the prophet's MO, as far as I'm able to tell, is they just start scapegoating all of the people that they're charged with stewarding for failing to follow their instructions to the letter. So there's always that excuse. Well, you know, you didn't follow my instructions to the letter. Whether we're talking about, you know, people going to cottage country during lockdowns, or the Jews worshiping the golden bull calf when Moses came down off of Mount Sinai with the tablets. And what does he do? He murders them all because they didn't follow his instructions to the letter. There's so the positive reputation for the boomers: principled, resolute, creative. Negative reputation: narcissistic, presumptuous, and ruthless. Yeah, that sounds about right to me. And I think if you're following the testimony in the POEC there, the Public Order Emergency Commission, you can see that they are quite presumptuous. And I'm going to point out some narcissism as well in some video clips. Now, their endowments is they have vision, values, and religion, obviously. And they are kind of returning to Christianity. And we see a lot of the millennials are following their lead as well. And the Gen Xers are still kind of feeling like, yeah, we don't really trust these institutions. We're not into that stuff. And we're the midlife nomad is also Han Solo's archetype, right? The original Star Wars is a fourth turning, and Han Solo is the one who's kind of like, yeah, I'm not so sure I believe all this Force stuff. And okay, kid, just try not to get us all killed. Like we're cynical, sardonic, so on and so forth. Back to the boomers here: vision, values, religion. That's them. And so the thing I want to underline here is this narcissistic, presumptuous, and ruthless negative reputation. Okay, those are exactly the kind of characteristics that need to be avoided when it comes to selecting senior leaders. Unfortunately, there's just a disproportionate number of unfit leaders to select from at this particular moment in our history, because they're all boomers at that particular age. So they've won the battle of attrition, and they're running things, and they don't know what they're doing. They really don't. But they're too narcissistic to be able to accept any help from the Gen Xers, because they kind of see all of their subordinates as essentially serfs. And we've had Valor Law on here talking about how all the folks in the military have been told they don't have rights since they signed the dotted line, which I've heard myself throughout my own career, and it's absolute rubbish. Of course, we're still Canadian citizens, and we still have voting rights, and we have human rights, and all the other stuff. Really, most of what we're giving up when we sign the dotted line is the right to collectively bargain. We can't form unions, right? And we're going to fall under the Code of Service Discipline as well. We're subject to the military justice system. Anyway, this narcissistic, presumptuous, and ruthlessness that we have in our senior leaders right now is kind of the problem. And what we need to do is we need to get some leaders in there who can steward these institutions through a major crisis. Well, what do we have over here? We have this reputation in the nomad archetype, a positive reputation, at least, of being savvy, practical, and perceptive. Okay, so that's what we're looking for in senior leaders for the purpose of navigating our institutions through this crisis. This is basically, I'm laying this down for you guys. This isn't Neil Howe talking. Well, yeah, actually, that is essentially the crux of what they're saying. What happens in the fourth turning with that generational changing of the guard, the peak institutional power, is that we get these leaders who kind of know how to make stuff happen. Because we have to come up in the wake of these narcissistic, presumptuous, and gluttonous wealth hoarders, and basically crowns for every scrap of wealth that we're able to garner in their gluttonous wake. So we're pretty good at getting stuff done. Let me see, I'm going to do one more here because we're looking at the hero as well. They have a positive reputation of being selfish, rational, and competent. Wonderful stuff, right? Negative reputation, unreflective, mechanistic, and overbold. Yeah, so that's the kind of Archie Bunker stuff that the boomers would have ridiculed them for. And according to Harvard, like, the boomers really do have the worst daddy issues on record, and that is the gravitron particle of in Strauss-Howe generational theory. Like, if the pendulum is swinging and the gravity that's pulling it is demography, then the gravitron particle itself is daddy issues. And the boomers have daddy issues for the greatest men that have ever existed, and so they make them out to be kind of overbold and boisterous and macho in the negative way. And their endowments include community, affluence, technology. So they're the ones who are going to bring us all back together to a point of social cohesion when they start moving up, when they become midlifers and then elders, as we continue on. But when they become elders, they're going to have to deal with the next generation of prophets entering early adulthood and driving us right back to hell come 2108 when we're scheduled for the next great crisis. So yeah, that's what we're kind of looking to. We're looking to get from these narcissistic, presumptuous, and ruthless leaders to the savvy, practical, perceptive leaders, and we want to get them working with the young adults who are selfish, rational, and competent. And also, as young adults, they're empowering. Okay, so that's the dream team right there. It's that, like I said, I think it's mostly last wave Gen Xers and first wave millennials, the micro generation of the Xennials that really seem to kind of jive well together. So I kind of lost where I'm going with this. I think I was just looking at some of Mark's stuff here before he came on, and I ended up going through quite a bit of other stuff with you guys here, mostly related to the Strauss-Howe generational theory stuff. But I wanted to, the reason why I wanted to bring this up with Mark is because he's the guy who's saying that Trudeau must go. While it's, well placed and all that stuff, it's not going to bring a resolution to this crisis. You have to understand, guys, like, Trudeau doesn't really he can't control things in Europe. He's not the one that's doing this globally. We're in a global crisis where all of the major powers are on a war footing, and that's not Trudeau doing that. Okay, he is just the Wizard of Oz. He's just a sock puppet, and the people who are the puppeteers are these senior bureaucrats in the public service and the financiers. They're in, the wealthy top 1% is the boomers, with few exceptions. Elon Musk being the Gen Xer who's making his way into that billionaire class right now. And what is he doing? He's saying he's fed up and he's buying Twitter, and he's calling BS on the boomers that went ahead of them with their, a lot of their stuff about alleviating world poverty with Elon Musk's money. And he's like, yeah, okay, show me the plan, boomer. Yeah, okay, boomer, show me the plan. You show me the plan that's going to do it, and I'll buy it. And of course, they produce nothing because they're all talk, and they've never really fixed any problems. They just kind of know how to make money and get on a winning team. So here we have an interesting exchange, I thought, that I just wanted to point out a few of these attributes.
Council, there are other inputs that can go into the meeting of that definitional standard that CSIS wouldn't normally use. And so that's very, very important to underline, that it is, while it is the same standard of the same magnitude, the interpretation of that standard is being done according to a wider set of criteria by a very different set of people with a different goal in mind, and that goal is given by the Emergencies Act and not the CSIS Act.
Okay, I want to back you up a little bit. You're familiar, I think, probably from your academic work as well as your work as a lawyer with a straw man argument.
I am indeed.
Yeah.
Try not to make them, but go right ahead.
So if anybody's not familiar with this, I'll throw it in. A straw man argument is it's those times when people, they'll take what you just said and they'll repeat it back to you in a kind of mocking way, usually. But they'll repeat it back in a way that states the argument you just presented in a weaker form to make your position appear more weak than it actually is. So they're not beating up on the real man, which is your argument. They're beating up on a straw man version of the real man in order to make their own position appear stronger. And it's sophistry, right? It's not logically sound reasoning. It's an informal logical fallacy, if I'm not mistaken. It's definitely a logical fallacy, though. So that's what he's saying is he's saying that people have presented the straw man fallacy as sound reasoning here somewhere, but I'll let them continue.
Has anybody suggested that the Emergencies Act delegates to CSIS the decision as to whether Cabinet can invoke the Emergencies Act or declare a public order emergency?
Well, I'm sorry, I just want to be clear. When you say has anybody suggested, we have to be concerned about cabinet confidence as well as solicitor-client privilege. So when you say anybody, it would be helpful if you specify who you're asking about.
Has anybody who's a party to this proceeding, let me put it that way, advanced the argument you just purported to debunk that Parliament had delegated the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act to CSIS?
Even if delegation is one end of the extreme, but even using the same standard or purporting that it be the same standard that is contained, the actual substantive standard that's contained in the CSIS Act is effectively doing the same thing.
The substantive standard contained in the CSIS Act is the one that Parliament said is assigned to the meaning of that standard in the Emergencies Act. That's not CSIS. That's not Cabinet. That's Parliament, what it did in 1985, right?
No, not exactly, because there's been evolution of the Act. You've heard from CSIS how they interpret that provision. And
yeah, there's been an evolution of the Act, and that evolution, well, there's no evidence of it in writing anywhere. It's in their imaginations, you see. And that's kind of what I've been dealing with in Canada's military for the last 20 years. They wipe their asses with that National Defence Act and stomp all over everybody's right to grieve, which we are granted in lieu of our right to collectively bargain in the military. And I keep saying we, even though I'm not in it anymore. But yeah. I can take these policies to them and I can point to the right to the grieve in the National Defence Act, and I can show them the policy that governs the evaluation process for promotion, which they flagrantly disregard year after year after year and cut corners on all of it. And see what they do. I keep using the evaluation process because it is the one that everybody's going to be the most familiar with. We all know that well, we keep hearing it's completely broken, but there's nothing wrong with the process itself. It's the fact of the matter is it hasn't been followed since the early to mid 2000s, because the silent generation retired from national defense altogether, and all we have left now are boomers. And so what they do, the profit generational archetype, is like I said, they give us our new religions. So they invent dogma, and that's what I see with the boomer generation, is that they are dogmatic. And so what ends up happening, I've had so many of these surreal experiences that leave me questioning my own sanity. I remember I grieved a PER once, and it was in relation to this practice where the higher command would receive the already scored and vetted PER, and what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to compile a list from everybody in the command to say, okay, the top 10 scorers are right here, and list those top 10. But that's not what they do. What they do is they do it the old way, pick their favorites, and then assign scores based on who the most popular people are. And that's explicitly prohibited in the policy, and that came out of the Somalia Affair report, that said you can't pick favorites and you can't do things that way. You need to follow a process, and gave them a process, and they never read the instructions. That's the God's honest truth. They never read the instructions. And so they go around kind of repeating these things, these anecdotes that we hear all the time. And I had this surreal experience one time with a boomer commanding officer, where I had submitted my notice of intent to grieve, and it was on the basis of the flagrant disregard for national policy at the command level. And when I went in to talk to him about it, when he brought me in to talk to him about it, he started off saying, I have 10 minutes, and then I got to go into a meeting. And I was like, I don't even need that much. And so we sat down, and I basically said, okay, here's the reference. We're not following it. That's why you got a grievance. And he starts out with a kind of, oh, I think I see what's going on here. A little pat on the head, Gen Xer, you're not as grown up as me. And he starts going on and on and on. He was like drawing graphs on the whiteboard and everything. And I just kept saying, like, where's the policy reference for this? And in the end, I had to stop him. He went for a good 40 or 45 minutes. He said he had 10 minutes. But the thing is, once you give him your attention, now it's the boomer show. And so he's just like, he's gesticulating and he's doing all these things like they're and drawn on the board, and it's all 100% pure BS. 100%. Everything he said was BS, and I was totally vindicated in the end of the grievance process, even though I paid a severe price for that one in the form of reprisals, which is not something you can ever prove, of course, because that's how they roll. They're all greasy and they stick together. But I still pursued the grievance, and I was vindicated. And the Chief of Defense Staff published a letter to the entire Canadian Armed Forces in 2015, ordering them to 2016 to start following that particular reference that I gave in that particular grievance. But they will invent a dogma. Basically what happens is they know what they want to do, and they're very emotive. They're driven by their emotions. They're not cerebral. They're not empirical. So it's really hard to get them out of that emotional state to a point where they can actually absorb new information. I haven't figured it out yet. So I've been trying for 20 years. But that's the thing, is they need to be shown everything. They need to be taken by the hand and shown the patterns of behavior that result in a successful outcome. And then they can kind of mimic those patterns of behavior. But what happens is they don't really know what they're doing. So they screw everything up. And then they just make up a bunch of excuses. And then that becomes the dogma. You can see this, I think, like Moses. I gave the example of Moses. He did some pretty horrible stuff to his own people. And apparently those stories weren't even written down until about 5 centuries after they happened. And the excuse back then for the democides of the prophet generation, if that's a word, a democide. As in a person being, what is a person that commits a democide? Is it just a mass murderer? Okay, so to excuse their mass murder, they come up with this dogma. Oh, it was God who was telling me to do it. And pardon me for the religious folks out there, but as you can see, I'm not exactly God-fearing, and I'm kind of taking a different analysis of this. They invent this dogma, and that's what you can see happening here. Is it's like there's a dogma that's being formed real time. He's just like, I know what I feel I want to do, and since I'm in charge, my feelings are true. And then it's just a matter of coming up with some highfalutin BS.
It's the argument you just purported to debunk. that Parliament had delegated the decision to invoke the...
Okay, so that's all very silly. Everybody knows that CSIS is not responsible for calling the Emergencies Act. That is the governor and council. It's like the prime minister in particular. Okay, but the standard of evidence for the emergency is what's given in the CSIS Act, and they're trying to say, well, no, that's just the standard of evidence for CSIS. It's not for the decision maker. And it's a bit of a bait and switch, I think, with the standards, what they're doing, because they have that definition and it applies to CSIS, obviously, when it comes to making their assessment, but they're saying that it stops there. So CSIS made their assessment and said that based on their very narrow view into the issue, they determined that there was no national security threat. But we took a broader view and looked at some social media posts and determined that it was, in fact, an emergency. And it's all based on this emotive claptrap that they just kind of, go around in circles, tying themselves in knots.
Even if it's delegation is one end of the extreme, but even using the same standard, or purporting that it be the same standard that is contained, the actual substantive standard that's contained in the CSIS Act is effectively doing the same thing.
The substantive standard contained in the CSIS Act is the one that Parliament said is assigned to the meaning of that standard in the Emergencies Act. That's not CSIS. That's not Cabinet. That's Parliament, what it did in 1985, right?
No, not exactly, because there's been evolution of the Act. You've heard from CSIS how they interpret that provision. And
yeah. So it's a reimagining of the law. And this is the kind of stuff that I saw in policy throughout the Canadian Armed Forces my entire career. It's not what it says to the rest of us, right? It's not what it says in plain language. It's this new standard that seemingly came out of nowhere. Okay, I think I lost myself in my presentation. What do I got here? Okay, so this is from Network. This is a movie from, I think, 1976. And I want you to pay attention to what this guy is saying. So 1976, this would have been around the time that the boomers were kind of, they're in their young adulthood, right? And maybe moving into more the yuppies didn't come on the scene really until the early 80s, but yeah, they're right around there. They're born, depending on your definition, 41 or 45. So anyway, that's who he's talking to right here.
A rich little man with white hair died. What has that got to do with the price of rice, right? And why is that woe to us? Because you people and 62 million other Americans are listening to me right now. Because less than 3% of you people read books. Because less than 15% of you read newspapers. Because the only truth you know is what you get over this tube. Right now, there is an entire generation that never knew anything that didn't come out of this tube.
Yeah, so he's talking about the boomers there. This was a real concern back then when they were coming of age. And this is the kind of stuff that I think the younger generations are really missing out on right now. The fact that they weren't always, they weren't always elders, and there's kind of a question of the quality of elder that we have right now. And I'm using the way that they've lived their lives to make the case that we have a low quality pool of applicants for our senior leadership positions due to demography at the current moment. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but I'll
Tube is the gospel, the ultimate revelation. This tube can make or break presidents, popes, prime ministers. This tube is the most awesome God force in the whole godless world. And woe is us if it ever falls into the hands of the wrong people. And that's why woe is us that Edward George Ruddy died.
Right. So the tube is the gospel. And that's, I think, what we're seeing right now in the split out there in Canadians is there are those who believe that the tube is gospel, the boomers, and then there are the rest of us who take a more mature view. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. The tube is gospel to the boomers, and they're the generation that never knew anything that didn't come out of that goddamn tube. And so, oh, that's another video I was trying to work on there with, you know what, guys, this really didn't turn out for some reason. I don't know what happened to my video, but I was looking at Jody Thomas. I really clued in when she was up there to the kinds of things that that she was saying. She really seems like she's a central figure in this, as is the chief of the Privy Council office, obviously. And that's kind of what they are saying, isn't it? Whether you're talking about Jim Watson or whether you're talking about Jody Thomas, they're being confronted with the highest standards of evidence that we can provide in the form of these intelligence reports coming from our professionalized institutions. And they are setting that aside in favor of what they saw on TV and social media. Yeah, I can't help but think that is part of the trap that we're caught in right now. It's like, it's just like he says, okay, woe to us if the awesome power of the tube ever falls into the wrong hands. And that's what's been happening, is that awesome power has fallen into the hands of the boomers. And they are kind of the white collar generation. They were spared from having to work while they were in high school. You know, they didn't do anything until after they graduated. And in the case of the military, they were just kind of, you know, taken by the hand and sent off to the recruiting center and never even had to go to war. And so they're just kind of these squishy cold warriors who think it's all about fun in the sun and the barbecues. And they never really developed the skills of, you know, leading a professional military. But they'll be damned if they're ever going to admit that, because of that narcissism, right? They just can't handle that power over the people. It goes right to their heads. Okay, and so I'm wrapping around here on my presentation. I think I kind of did the best I could to play that hand. We got about 2 hours and 20 minutes of content on a show that I didn't even have a guest for. So I think I probably lined up a little bit too much content for him, but I wasn't going to go as deep when he showed up. But I'll be really interested to hear what Mark has to say, because he seems to be the only other guy right now. Well, you know, that might be an exaggeration, but he's the most prominent guy right now who's kind of saying the same thing that I am, that getting rid of Trudeau is not going to be the end of this battle, okay? He is not the primary target. The primary target is much bigger than that, okay? It's a generation, and of course I'm talking about targeting for firing, not for any kind of abuse whatsoever. You know, perhaps investigating and engaging with some judicial processes wherever there's evidence that laws were broken, and allowing those judicial processes to play out. So we're not going to lynch them like they used to do. Okay, lynching was actually named for a nomad Jenner. I don't remember what his first name was, but that's who it was named after. Yeah, we're the kind of don't mess around generation. We have that reputation for cruelty and stuff. But look, we're a kinder, gentler nomad Jenners these days. So you know, we're very good people, and I think that the demographers that I've read that have studied us have kind of come to the same conclusion, that in spite of the rough exterior, the fact of the matter is that we, when it gets down to brass tacks, we're very principled, and you know, we do care about the suffering of others. We're quite empathetic when we need to be, even though we're quite detached from our own emotions most of the time. But we have to be, okay, to deal with a lot of the challenges that we end up facing. That's it for today, folks. I'll throw to a couple of comments here before I sign off. I really appreciate everybody joining me as usual. I know I haven't been putting out as much content as usual this month, mostly because I'm busy with a lot of my own stuff on the home front, but that's coming to a close really soon with the winter weather coming in. So I'll be back to my usual levels of productivity before you know it. Also, I'm kind of enjoying just taking in the live streams and stuff myself. I usually catch them later in the day because I like to listen to it all on like double speed or something. It's just too damn slow. I'll listen to War Campaign. You know, Rowan over there is a friend of V4F, and he's been doing a really great job. all day, every day, staying in tune to that live stream and up to the minute coverage. So I've been tracking him, just kind of watching a few hours behind schedule with the double time speed and everything. And man, oh man, I'm clipping videos, I'm putting stuff together, and I'm just like, there is so much content here. I almost don't even know where to start with it, but I'm getting everything that I thought I was going to see and everything that I wanted to be able to kind of build my case here, using that Strauss-Howe generational theory. And I think if you're paying really close attention to what these senior bureaucrats are saying, it's very much in line with what I'm kind of saying about how they seem to, in my experience, they kind of emote their way through every decision. And it really just kind of comes down to whatever the person in charge wants. And we've seen this elsewhere, like say, for example, with the Mark Norman affair, where he said he had a story to tell, but he never did tell after he got his settlement. But what I was reading from that situation was that everybody was just kind of going out of their way to get in good with the big guy and kiss up to the regime by going after Mark Norman, even though he didn't really do anything illegal or wrong, just because he fell out of favor with regime. So that's the kind of polarization and kissing up, the kind of corruption that we see happening mindlessly, haphazardly, because everybody is simply preoccupied with their careers and keeping their bosses happy. And that's what I saw. That's what's been wrong with the complaints process throughout in the Canadian Armed Forces, with the evaluation process. It has everything to do with attrition that we've suffered over the last multiple years since the war ended. It's because once the war is gone, we go right back to this Cold War era mentality of fun in the sun and barbecues, and everything's back to falling apart again. Since they don't follow the rules, people kind of get fed up and they leave. And now they're running everything, and as you can see, they don't follow the rules. They don't. They look at something like the Emergencies Act, where it's clearly stated that there's a certain standard, and they're saying, well, actually, it doesn't really say what every other generation previously had interpreted it to say. It says this additional thing that the Governor and Council has a broad discretion to declare an emergency on a basis that is yet to be explained, as far as I am aware. The kinds of metrics that they used in determining that there was a national level emergency on the basis of their social media tweets or social media posts that they were reading and whatnot. And there's all kinds of stuff in there, like even in their intelligence reports, they're telling them like, a flag is just a flag until you know why the person is holding it, and social media posts are mostly just shit posts. And they disregard all of that in favor of what? Their feelings. So they're looking at all these, the hype in the TV and the hype on the social media. They feel scared, and when the boomers feel scared, we get crushing brutality like we saw in Somalia. And also, I think there was an element of insolence that was being, that's really kind of, yeah, they see any challenge to something they're saying when they're in a position of authority as insolence. It doesn't matter how grounded in reality it is and how overwhelming the evidence is. If you're in a lower station than they are, you're just being insolent. And I can see it all over the face of these bureaucrats like Jody Thomas when the convoy lawyers step up to the mic. It's in their tone. It's in the way they hold their heads. I keep watching for the boomer look, because when they feel like you're being insolent, they give you this kind of "how dare you" look, where they put the nose right up in the air. So I keep looking for that when they're doing this, because that's the way that they speak in front of crowds, and whenever they seem to have attention, they kind of put their noses up. And if somebody says, "Well, wait a second here, like the sky is actually blue," they'll go, "How dare you?" And they're essentially the Puritans. The new Puritans, the new Victorians, because that is the same generational archetype as those previous generations. But anyway, I could probably continue there. We see Darlene is saying, they are the insolent ones. They'll never bow, not now, not ever. Thank you. Yeah, I can't help but agree. It does seem to be the case that it was never really about peace. It was just kind of about them and them getting their way all the time. They sang war is over with Yoko Ono, but as soon as they aged into the presidency, it's been nonstop war ever since. And they are the war industrial complex at this point in our history, right? They're the corporations and CEOs and blah blah blah. So let's see what else we got here. The TV is the world's biggest propaganda machine. Yeah, I agree. Okay, like you always have to consider like the source of the information, and there are all kinds of motivations. Like people are not always consciously aware of what's motivating them in any particular moment. You kind of need to stop and take stock of those things, in order to facilitate good ethical decision making. But most of the time, I think people are just kind of following their fear these days. And what's the TV putting out there but fear, 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 and it keeps them in this state of derangement where they just want this to end, and so they're basically begging the establishment to relinquish them because they've been good little people, and of course when nothing they do works, they scapegoat the unvaccinated, just like they scapegoated the midlifers in Salem and had them hanged for witchcraft. So that's what happens. That's how you get a witch hunt. Is the elder prophet is reigning in the new theocracy. The hero generational archetype is coming of age, and they want to help. They want to eliminate the evil. And the prophet generational archetype is saying, it's the Gen Xers. It's their fault. Get them. And so that's what they do, is they come after us. Now, the pitchforks are digital and financial, but the fires are still very real, as per the CNN what is the word I'm looking for? The CNN Chiron of fiery but mostly peaceful protests, which is another boomerism, by the way. There's no such thing as a fiery but mostly peaceful protest. That's called a riot. But that's the kind of game that they play with language, right? And we see them doing that with the Emergencies Act now, where public order emergencies can be more than what the law says they are. And where it says any of this stuff, and where the legal procedures that they were following throughout this are written down, has yet to be determined. But I think you guys already know that there's no real answer for this. This is just the dogma that's been invented to excuse themselves for their own malfeasance. Just like the Vietnam War was evil dogma. It wasn't, okay? It was every bit as justified as Korea. And it was a UN war, not a US war. It's just that the UN doesn't actually have any troops. They got to get the US to do all their fighting for them. The boomers never took up that responsibility, and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I think I'm repeating myself now, guys. Let's see. Ken is always a faithful watcher here, so I'll throw to him. An old timer I had a coffee with today said there would be a lot less lying in government if they brought back capital punishment. Thoughts? I'm not a believer in capital punishment, Ken. Basically because, well, look up something like the Innocence Project that we got back in the 90s there when DNA evidence became a thing. We saw 1 in 8 death row inmates being exonerated by DNA evidence. So we as humans, we are eminently flawed, easily corrupted, and so we got to build institutions that are resilient against human corruption. And I don't think that we're ever going to eliminate the human element from the process sufficiently to be able to guarantee that we won't execute an innocent person. And so for that reason, primarily, I don't believe in capital punishment. And also, I do think that, if you spend, let's say we take the boomers and we take those COVID isolation facilities in their dogmatic vernacular, which are actually concentration camps to the rest of us, and maybe we rebrand those something like maximum security retirement homes, right? And I kind of think that a life spent imprisoned with having your freedom revoked until the day that you die of natural causes is probably a fate worse than the kind of euthanasia that we offer for capital punishment right now. Not that we should be more cruel. I really think that we got to get away from all the cruelty, and it really should be about imposing these more civilized punishments that we can provide compensation for where we make mistakes. We can't go back on a death penalty. You know, and I find that it's very much out of touch with everything that I'm advocating for, because I'm always talking about like the fourth turning and Star Wars, and it's about light side versus dark side. And the dark side is the ego, the emotion. Okay, it's the animal in which we reside. Okay, our consciousness is part of a broader animal, and the deep recesses of our mind is really kind of where our thoughts come from, and that's the animal sort of trying to coerce us, trying to make us paranoid, and trying to make us they coerce us through paranoia and through pain to go along with the animal instincts. But at the end of the day, the animal is cruel and brutal, and you follow your heart, you follow your ego, and you will live to regret it. Yeah, I think we need to get away from those more animalistic practices and something more towards a kind of enlightened consciousness revolution type thing. I think I lost my perspicacity there, guys. So I'm gonna sign off now before my vocabulary drops off altogether. Thanks again for joining me. I babbled on for 2.5 hours, even though my guest wasn't able to join me. By the way, I forgot to mention this because there was a video that was playing while I was reading, but Mark Friesen did message me over Facebook, and he said that he got called out to work. You know, maybe I should just start recording these things ahead of time so that I can reschedule instead of getting stood up for my live streams. I got to catch up with Chris Milburn on that too. But enough said, folks. That's enough out of me. Stay frosty and stay safe.